Welcome. My name is Jody Siegel. I'm the Executive Director of Southern Legal Counsel in Gainesville. This is Simone Chris, an attorney with Southern Legal Counsel. Southern Legal Counsel is a statewide public interest law firm. We do a lot of advocacy on behalf of kids with disabilities in special education. We do a lot of advocacy for people that need housing, that have been discriminated against, homeless people. So we have a variety of things we do. But I've been practicing special education law for over 30 years, I think. How many people here have done any special education advocacy? All right, good. So you may know a lot of this, and so we hope it's not too basic for you. So we're going to be talking about obtaining trauma-informed educational services under the IDEA in Section 504. So before we get into it, we have a prize for this. So who can say, I guess some of you should disqualify the people that have done special ed before, but who knows what my HI child with 4 ACEs needs an IEE to receive FAPE because his MDR found that he didn't have an FBA or a BIP? Who can say what that means? Anybody? Oh, I thought I saw one hand. Can anyone say what part of it is? There's some animal crackers here, so anyone want to give it a try? All right, so I'll say I did it fast just for effect, but so my HI child, hearing impaired child, 4 ACEs, needs an IEE, individual education evaluation, to receive FAPE, free appropriate public education, because his MDR, Manifestation Determination Review, found that he didn't have an FBA or BIP. Functional Behavioral Assessment or BIP. All right, well, I don't know who gets these, but we'll save them for later and figure that out. All right, so these are the topics we're going to be covering: the impact of trauma on learning. We're going to learn about the IDEA and Section 504, and you'll even learn about what IDEA means if you don't know that. And we're going to then turn to advocacy tips, which is really the heart of what we're trying to do here, is to get services for kids that need them. So do each of you have a little card? We're going to use them in a minute. So hold on to those and you'll see what it's all about. Someone doesn't? Okay, now they do. All right, I'll get you one more. Is there an extra card that someone has? Could you hand them all? Oh, there. Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to start by talking about trauma. I know it's a word that we hear a lot lately. Raise your hand if you've heard of ACEs. Okay, it's being widely discussed, but we're going to go a little bit deeper into what that means for the children that you serve, because in order to advocate for trauma-informed services, you have to have an understanding of what trauma is and how it impacts your clients. So we're going to start with a clip from my favorite TED Talk. It's only a very short clip, but it's sort of going to bring home what I'm going to talk about.
In the mid-90s, the CDC and Kaiser Permanente discovered an exposure that dramatically increased the risk for 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States. In high doses, it affects brain development, the immune system, hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. Folks who are exposed in very high doses have triple the lifetime risk of heart disease and lung cancer, and a 20-year difference in life expectancy. And yet doctors today are not trained in routine screening or treatment. Now, the exposure I'm talking about is not a pesticide or packaging chemical. It's childhood trauma.
All right, so what is trauma? I know it's talked about a lot and it seems like sort of a vague concept, but trauma occurs when, overwhelmingly stressful events undermine a person's ability to cope. And what I mean by trauma isn't, when you're young and you fall off your bike and break your arm, or you fail a test, or you don't get invited to a birthday party. What I mean by trauma are things like neglect and abuse, having a parent who's incarcerated, being removed from your home and placed in foster care. Those are traumas. And now complex trauma stems from exposure to persistent sources of these adverse childhood experiences. So violence, neglect, loss, etc. And now when we're talking about stress, exposure to stressful events, there's a degree of stress that's good, that's positive. We all need a little bit of stress to learn how to cope with adversity, and it's a normal, healthy part of child development. When a child's stress response system is activated, which in a little bit I'm going to talk to you about how a child's stress response system is activated and what that looks like. But when that happens, and it's in an environment of supportive relationships and stability, the psychological effects are buffered. So they come up here when the stress occurs, and then they're able to be brought back down by relationships with supportive people in their environment. But what happens is when children are exposed to complex trauma and they have these persistent sources of stress, they aren't turned on then off. It's just, it stays on. They aren't able to come back down and buffer. So, for example, I'm super nervous right now. I'm feeling very stressed out, if we're being honest about this presentation. Chest is tight, feeling short of breath, pupils dilated, open airways, all of those things that happen when you're stressed out. But hopefully, after this, someone at least will tell me I did okay, and those stress levels, please, she's my boss, stress levels will come back down, and I'll be okay. And that's normal. It should do this. When it becomes complex trauma and when it creates toxic stress, which is what happens with a lot of the children that you serve, is it comes up and there's nobody to help them bring it back down. There's nothing in their life to help them bring it back down. So it becomes their state of equilibrium, this hyperarousal. So this is basically what I just talked about. All right, so the ACEs study, which I know a lot of you are familiar with. This was the largest study investigating the relationship between childhood trauma and later health outcomes in life. What I find interesting and what a lot of people don't know about the ACEs study is it didn't start as a way to look at how common child abuse is or things like that. It actually was in 1985, Dr. Vincent Felitti was running an obesity clinic, and he found that a lot of his patients who were successfully losing weight were dropping out of the clinic, and he could not understand it. They were successful, they were losing weight, why are they leaving? And I think it was just one client that started this idea for him, but he talked to one person who disclosed to him that when she was younger, she was sexually abused, and that keeping on the weight was sort of a protective factor for her. It was a way for her to not be noticed, to not be a target, to not be a victim. And so he started talking to the other clients who dropped out, and he found so many of these people who were dropping out of his clinic after successfully losing weight had been sexually or physically abused as children, and they felt that the weight was a protective factor. So that led to him doing this study where 17,000 individuals answered questions as to whether they'd experienced physical abuse, emotional or psychological abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence, mental illness or mental health disorder in the home, substance use disorder in the home, incarcerated household member, parental separation or divorce, emotional neglect, and physical neglect. And these are not the only adverse childhood experiences that are impacting children, that are impacting the children that you serve. We're going to talk about some other ones later, but these are the ones that they looked at in this study. And so what I want you guys to do before we discuss the results of that study, I want to do our own study real quick. So you all have a card in front of you, and you also have uploaded to the app, there's a copy of the ACE study with all 10 questions. I'm going to read them out up here, and they're up on this slide, but what I want you to do, and this is completely anonymous, I want you to put count 1 point for each of these that you answer yes to. And it doesn't matter whether it's something that happened every day for 7 years of your life or if it just happened a couple times when you were 13. it's still 1 point. You're not counting the instances, you're counting whether this situation happened ever. So, number 1, did a parent or other adult in the household often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically hurt? By the way, at the end of this, you're just going to put the total number. I just want you to circle the total number. Number 2, did a parent or other adult in the household often push, slap, grab, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? Number 3, did an adult or person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you in a way, or have you touch their body in a sexual way, or try to actually have oral, anal, or vaginal sex with you? 4, did you often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special, or your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? 5, did you often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, and had no one to protect you? Or were your parents ever too drunk or high to take care of you or take you to the doctor if you needed it? 6, were your parents ever separated or divorced? 7, was your mother or stepmother often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her? Or sometimes or often kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard? Or ever repeatedly hit over at least a few minutes or threatened with a gun or a knife? 8, did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic or who used street drugs? 9, was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? And 10, did a household member go to prison? So what I want you to do, if you feel comfortable, is just write the number of yeses that you answered. So whatever that number is, circle it, and then fold your card in half. And if you wouldn't mind passing them down, no one will see them. There's no way to identify who put what. If you don't want to answer, you don't have to, but we're going to do a little experiment.
Okay, so pass them to the aisle.
Pass them to the center of the aisle, please. All right, so while those are being passed out, we have a lot of information, so unfortunately I have to keep going. So what I think we might find, and what was found in the Kaiser Permanente and CDC study, was that ACEs are far more common than anyone anticipated, first of all. 2/3 of the people who responded to this study had experienced ACEs, which means 2/3 of people had experienced complex trauma. And this wasn't a study of low income, bad neighborhood, high poverty areas. This was, whoa, just making sure you guys are all awake. So this was 70% Caucasian, 70% college degree, and 2/3 of people had experienced at least one of these traumas. The study also showed that as the number of ACEs a child experienced increased, the risk of the following health problems increased in a strong and graded fashion. It was like a dose-response relationship. And I didn't put all the charts on here because I'm sure you guys have all seen them ad nauseum, but I mean, it's just staggering how if you have 4 or more ACEs, you are more likely to literally die 10 years earlier. You're more likely to get heart disease, liver disease, COPD, alcoholism, all of these leading killers of humans in the United States. So why should you guys screen for ACEs with the children that you serve? The answer is, by the end of my spiel on trauma, you're going to understand that a child that you work with an ACE score of 4 or more is 4.5 times as likely to become depressed and 12 times as likely to attempt suicide. All right, so just to put this into more visual, I want you to notice that the number of women who experience sexual abuse before the age of 18 is almost 25%. That's 1 in 4. And like I said, this was a 70% Caucasian, 70% college-educated group. This is not the type of people that you guys are typically working with. Children in foster care have experienced severely higher ACEs than this. We'll get to that. And decades of research have proven that not only are the ACEs, this study was done in 1985. Since then, there have been lots of things added to this list of ACEs that we should screen for with children, including Poverty. Poverty is a huge indicator of poor health outcomes later. Witnessing violence, community violence, if there's guns being fired in your community, death in the family, natural disasters, being removed from the home and placed into foster care, and lack of access to basic necessities like food, clothing, and a shelter. So the ACE study was done in California. So, you guys might be thinking that's not here, that's in California. Well, let's look at what's going on in Florida. In 2014, the 8th Judicial Circuit Guardian Ad Litem program alone, which is where we are in Gainesville, was appointed to more than 500 cases of children who had been abused and neglected and abandoned. Florida's public schools currently have 70,215 homeless students. 97% of youth in Florida's Department of Juvenile Justice report having experienced trauma, with half of them experiencing 4 or more ACEs. Half. During the 2013 to 2014 school year, there were at least 10,340 school-related arrests in Florida's public schools. So this is putting children in the school-to-prison pipeline, which is re-traumatizing. Everything on here is a trauma in and of itself. So think about the kids you serve. If you have a foster child that you're advocating for, they probably got into foster care as a result of abuse or neglect or abandonment. That's an ACE. They were removed from their home. That's an ACE. Sometimes there are parents who have problems with substance abuse, drugs, alcohol, etc. Sometimes there's a parent who's in jail. That's an ACE. Multiple placements, moving from place to place. That's an ACE. Anyway, all of these are just examples of, if you start thinking about it, how many ACEs the children you serve might have. All right, so how does trauma result in chronic disease? I'm going to not spend a lot of time on this because I'm going to go through these in more detail in a little bit, but basically the experience happens, it disrupts their neural development, the structuring of their brain. This leads to social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. They adopt health risk behaviors, and then disease, disability, and social problems result, and finally early death. All right, so the effects of trauma. In addition to everything we just talked about, you're working with kids right now. You're representing kids today. And yes, maybe in 10 years they might develop liver disease, but what's happening right now to these children? Well, decades of medical research have showed that exposure to trauma, complex trauma, can literally debilitate a child's ability to learn. It can alter their physical, emotional, cognitive, and social development. And what's interesting is some children who've been exposed to complex trauma do exhibit symptoms of PTSD, conduct disorders, ADHD, etc., but some of them don't exhibit symptoms that are sufficient to merit an actual diagnosis. And for those of you who are familiar with the IDEA, you have to fall into one of their diagnosed disabilities that qualify. And so some of these children who might be doing fine in school, but these ACEs are debilitating them in so many other ways, their needs are left unaddressed. So before you can advocate for the children that you represent in terms of trauma, you have to understand a few things. And the first is that a traumatized brain has 3 critical impacts. The first is that the emotional brain becomes the survival brain. And the way that I like to explain this to people is, picture that you have a horse, a wild horse, right? And the wild horse is your emotional brain. And then you've got the rider on top of the horse holding the reins, and the rider is your logical brain, okay? So when a child that has been impacted by trauma is triggered, and it could be a sight, a sound, anything like that, a smell, and it reminds them of that trauma, it's like the logical brain, the rider, falls off the horse. Okay, it's gone, it's disabled, that rider is off, and that emotional brain takes off. That emotional brain, that horse, has one focus, and that's survival. Okay, so to give you an example, a child's in a classroom, and a teacher calls on that child, and they don't mean to alarm or upset the child, but they say, he's not paying attention. Chris, says it kind of loud. That child, if that triggers them, that loud sound, hearing their name like that, the voice of the teacher reminds them of their mom, who abused them, anything like that, any kind of trigger, that logical brain is disabled. The rider has fallen off the horse, and their emotional brain engages, and all they're thinking about is that trauma. They're reliving it. So in that moment, reading the passage out of the book that the teacher asked or reciting their multiplication tables is not only not their priority, but they literally can't do it. They are literally disabled from doing it. And so teachers often mistake this, and not just teachers, foster parents, attorneys, whoever is interacting with this child, they often misinterpret that as disobedience or defiance or apathy, when really it's just a neurological response that the child can't control. So the alarm system in the brain becomes distorted, perceiving danger everywhere. Like I said, a classmate knocks over a chair innocently. That could trigger them. Last night, a chair was knocked over when Dad came home in an alcoholic rage. Suddenly, learning is not what they're focused on. They're focused on survival. And 3 is the inability to learn from experience. So in the first years of life, neural connections, synapses, are being strengthened as they're used and pruned when they're not used. So I like to think of this as, I go to the gym and I only ever work out my arms. My arms are going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, but I never do legs, never, ever, ever do leg day. My leg muscles are going to get smaller and smaller. I wish this was a hypothetical. I don't do leg day. But the brain is a muscle, and what you use gets strengthened, and what you don't use gets pruned. So think about it. If in the first years of life, as a baby, you cry because you're hungry, you cry because you're wet, you cry because you're scared. When you cry and your mom or dad or caretaker picks you up and comforts you, when you cry because you're hungry and you're given food, when you cry because you're wet and you're changed, that strengthens the areas of the brain that support communication, socialization, safety, stability. But when you're left crying day after day and those needs are not met, the areas of your brain that are firing, the synapses that are firing, the connections that are strengthening are those for stress, anxiety, fear, anger. And this, we think that, babies, they're not getting it, they're not paying attention, but really the architecture of their brains are being shaped. And so children aren't born with working memory, mental flexibility, self-control, but they are born with the ability to develop them. So when I'm talking about trauma, I've been doing this research on trauma for a while, and a lot of times I get blank stares, people don't really get it, and I found that the best way to explain trauma is, too soon. All right, close your eyes, you ruined it. I've been practicing this forever. Close your eyes and pretend that you're walking in the woods. Super chill, just walking in the woods, birds, trees. Okay, now open your eyes and there's a bear. But let's give you a chance at actually surviving. There's a bear. It's a little farther away. When you see that bear, your hypothalamus sends a message to your pituitary, which sends a message to your adrenal gland, which says produce stress hormones, okay? Cortisol, adrenaline, all of that. So your heart starts pounding, your pupils dilate, your airways open up, and your body in that moment is prepared to either fight that bear or run. And that's fantastic if you're in the woods and there's a bear. However, what happens when that bear comes home every night and that stress response system is activated over and over and over again, and it goes from being adaptive and would save your life if there was a bear to being maladaptive and rewiring your brain structure to be in a constant state of fight or flight? It impacts your immune system, your developing hormonal system, and even the way that your DNA is read and transcribed. So when a child is exposed to trauma, the brain becomes oversensitized, and any potential stimulus, like we talked about before, the chair being knocked over, the teacher calling on them, sends them into fight or flight mode. And this eventually just becomes, like I said, for me, it's going up, and then after this presentation, I hope it comes down. But for kids constantly exposed to trauma, it's just up and it stays on. And so what this does is, in a non-trauma sensitive environment with, whether it's the school, DJJ, a foster home, a group home, in a non-trauma sensitive environment, these children are so often viewed as disruptive or unruly. And so the punishment is they might be isolated from other students. They might be placed in solitary. They might be moved from placement to placement. And each of these things re-traumatizes that child. So schools that subject children to, punitive and counterproductive suspensions, expulsions, transfers, referrals to law enforcement, and push them into the criminal justice system. These are just re-traumatizing events. These children, what we all have to understand, all these systems need to work together to understand that children who've experienced trauma lack self-regulation skills. And so they sometimes express, disproportionate reactivity. So an example is, my family did foster care for most of my life. I've had dozens and dozens of foster siblings, and I have an adopted little sister named Jamaica. And her go-to is if she's in class and she gets called on, or she's, confronted by her soccer coach, or anything that makes her feel unsafe, she shuts down, just completely nothing. And her teachers view it as apathy. Jamaica doesn't care. She's not trying. That's not it. She literally cannot formulate a response. She was severely abused when she was very, very young. And then on the other side of that, I was representing a kid. I worked for the Gator Team Child Clinic at UF Law School, and I represented a foster child who kept blowing placements over and over and over, and we couldn't figure out why. And anytime she felt threatened or unsafe, or like someone was challenging her, she would just explode. I mean, like throw things, scream, explode. But what was interesting was when I would talk to her later about, why did that happen? She had no memory. She didn't remember what happened right beforehand. She didn't remember doing it. And a lot of people in her life didn't believe her and were like, you remember what you did. But truly, once they go into that fight or flight mode, they're not forming memories. They're just surviving. Okay, so this is just to show you that what I'm talking about isn't hypothetical. It's not, there could be changes in the brain. These are real changes to a child's brain. The one on the left is a normal brain. The one on the right is a brain of a 3-year-old who has been extremely neglected. These are very, very real physical changes to the brain. All right, so the populations disproportionately impacted by trauma, I'm sure we could all guess, are children in foster care, children with disabilities, those in the juvenile justice system, those experiencing poverty and homelessness, African American children, Hispanic children, and those who identify as LGBT. So what does it mean to be trauma-informed? It's a paradigm shift in the way that we view children that goes from what's wrong with you to asking the question of what happened to you, which is why we have to screen for ACEs. So this means attorneys, judges, social workers, volunteers, foster parents, everyone has to be trauma-informed. So right now we know more than ever about the effects of trauma on the brain, but also the ways to mitigate trauma, the ways to help children move on from this and be productive and successful in their lives. It's kind of like when we found out that smoking caused lung cancer, we were like, oh, let's shift away from that. Let's fix that. This is an epidemic that's impacting so many of our children, and we have to figure out the solution. We have to start using these tools. So early and effective interventions that teach children resilience. Resilience is our ability to remain calm and cope when faced with adversity. And so many studies have proven that just one close relationship, one, with a supportive adult can mitigate the impacts of trauma and can change a child's life. And I think you know the super stereotypical thing I'm about to say. You could be that one person. It just takes one. All right, so how do we incorporate trauma sensitivity into our practice of law as child advocates? We have to incorporate an awareness of how prevalent ACEs are. We have to assume that what we're seeing in that petition filed by CLS or in their case file is only the tip of the iceberg. That's not everything. We have to screen for ACEs ourselves. And if you go online, there are so many resources for whatever agency you might work for, whatever position you might be in as an attorney, a social worker, a volunteer. There's so many resources for how to screen your children for ACEs, because you can't fix the problem if you don't know what it is. And then advocating for trauma, and that's sort of the purpose of this whole thing. Advocating for trauma-informed services for your clients in schools. Schools are the largest system that interacts with children. So some kids might be in DJJ, some might be in DCF, some might be, in various places, but all children, hopefully, are going to be in school. So I view schools as the ideal vehicle to deliver these services to children impacted by trauma. You need to seek specific services, which is what Jody's going to talk about, that are tailored to your client's needs. And also, it's so important to inform the foster parent, caregiver, whoever it is taking care of this child, of what the child's triggers are, okay? Because once you can figure out what their triggers are, you can avoid re-traumatizing the child, and you can figure out how to buffer them, how to bring them back down once they have been triggered. But in order for you to pass that information on to the caregivers, the foster parents, whomever, you first have to discover it for yourself, which is why we have to screen for ACEs. All right, Jody's going to take it over now.
Right.
You did great.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, you can calm down now, right? All right, so 65 of you turned in cards. And how many, just throw out a number, what do we think was the percentage of people that had one or more ACEs? Well, the answer is 72%. So 3/4 of you have had at least, and on this, and this isn't even asking about community violence. This is the old ACEs. You know, it's not asking about have you been traumatized by Hurricane Katrina or whatever. I mean, there are other traumas. 72% of you, and you know, we are not, we are in a different privileged group here. This is not representative of the kids we represent. So the number of ACEs is going to be even more in those kinds of environments. 2 or more, 54% of you had ACEs. 3 or more, which is really a pretty high number. It's the number that you look at and say there must be something going on. Really, 1/3 of you, 34%, and 20% of you had 4 or more. And you should know that there were 3 people that had a 6, 7, and a 9 number on their ACEs. So, you know, even in just, you know, your neighbors, people you know, people, your colleagues are affected by trauma. And that's really what this is meant to show. This is real and it's pervasive. Okay, so I'm going to talk about kids with disabilities that have experienced trauma. Now, not every one of our kids in the dependency system are kids with disabilities. So it's important to remember that the IDEA and Section 504 do not apply to children who don't have disabilities. You have to have a disability in order to apply for the special education services. And, but if the child has a disability, then these are powerful tools in order to obtain needed services to address the trauma. So these are only one tool. I mean, there are plenty of other ways to address it, but this is important. I put this here, you can look at it later. It's just the citation so that you can come back to it if you need it. So the first thing about the IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is that first we have to find the children that have disabilities, otherwise we can't advocate for them, otherwise they don't get services. So the obligation is on the school district, period. It's on the school district to locate and evaluate every child with a disability who needs special education who's residing in Florida. Residing, so this includes immigrants and so forth. So each of these terms, like every other area of the law, is going to have a lot of case law about what it is, a definition, and so forth. So a child with a disability who needs special education, we're going to talk about in a minute. But know that this specifically includes the IDEA in 2004. For some reason, they thought they had to add that includes homeless and wards of the state because they were being ignored. It included them before that from the very beginning, but this was an understanding that kids who are homeless and wards of the state are, you know, needed to be found, as well as children in private schools. It specifically excludes children ages 18 to 21 who are incarcerated if they didn't have an IEP already provided. So, who's eligible? So there's 2 parts, Part B, Part C. Part C is the little kids, 0 to 3. Not going to really talk about that. There's a different set of procedures, but do know that they have rights under the IDEA if they have a disability that's acknowledged at that point. So Part B, which is the main part of the IDEA, is 3 to 21 if they have not graduated with a regular diploma. They have to have a disability, which we're going to talk about, and need the special education and related services. But they do not need to be failing or have been retained. They have to need it, but you don't have to wait until they fail in order to prove that they need it. And they can be advancing grade to grade. So these are the listed disabilities. IDEA actually says you have to be one of these disabilities in order to qualify. This is different from 504, which we'll talk about in a minute. So the ones that come up most often for kids with trauma, they manifest as having a serious emotional disturbance, and these are the federal words. Florida uses different words. Other health impairment or developmental delay, which is only for 3 through 9. And I put the Florida Administrative Code rule for the Florida specific criteria. So a child may have any of the listed disabilities. It doesn't have to be one of those. Those are just the ones that are most often. And they can also experience trauma. Or a child can already have a disability and then experience the trauma and experience trauma. Wait, let me start that over. You can already have a disability and experience trauma and need services for trauma. But is trauma an actual disability? And that's where there's a lot of discussion and where we're going, whether or not to include. There's some advocacy saying it should be included as a specific disability. We may get there, I don't know. Right now it's not a specific disability. So you have to look at how the trauma is manifesting on the learning in order to determine whether there is a disability that you can qualify as. And like in Florida, it's called emotional behavioral disability instead of serious emotional disturbance. So once we identify them and have evaluated them, determine they need special education services, the obligation on the school district is then to provide FAPE, free, appropriate public education. And that is defined as special education and related services provided at public expense and to meet the unique needs of the child. So special education is defined as specially designed instruction at no cost to meet the unique needs of the child, but it's not limited to academics. You can have special education needs that include social, emotional, or behavioral, which is where the needs for the treatment and services for trauma come under. They also may clearly have some academic needs, but it's not limited to academic needs. So specially designed instruction is adapting the curriculum, the methodology, the delivery instruction, and so forth. And right now I'm just going through some of the definitions, and then we can, so that you have a basic understanding, we can talk about how to use these as tools. Related services are the things that you need in order to enable you to be able to learn and benefit from the special education. So it's not the education itself, but transportation, developmental, corrective, other supportive services required to assist a child with a disability to benefit from special education. This list is not exhaustive. This is a sample list that's in the IDEA. But you can see, I mean, transportation is the classic one. If you can't get to school, you can't learn. So that just kind of is the way to think about it. What do you need in order to learn? Well, kids with trauma are going to need possibly psychological services. They may need a dog. I think that's a great thing. Let's ask for dogs in IEP meetings. So whatever it is that the child needs in order to then be able to benefit from the special education is what would be called a related service. Okay, so when we're representing kids in the dependency system, it's important to know who's a parent. Under the IDEA, there are many parents or many potential parents. And the importance of this is that this whole act centers around parental participation. So if there's not someone to advocate for the child is going to get lost and not get the services they need. So we need to figure out who's the parent. It can be a natural or adoptive parent. It can be a foster parent. It can be a legal guardian. It can't be the state. And it can't be a guardian ad litem. It can be an individual acting in place of the parent with whom the child lives or has legal responsibility. So grandma can be a parent just for the IDEA. That's all we're talking about here, is a parent that is considered a parent who can act as a parent and do the things that a parent would do. A surrogate parent is appointed to act as a parent. Either the school district or a juvenile court can appoint a surrogate parent. So we need one of these people in every child's life to be able to go to IEP meetings, request the records, challenge the IEP if that's what's necessary. But none of that will happen without someone that's designated as a parent. Now, possibly there's going to be more than one parent. There could be a biological, there could be and a foster parent, or biological and someone the child lives with. And so the court can identify a specific person to act as a parent, which would overcome the presumption that the biological gets to say what that child needs. So if the biological parent isn't attending IEP meetings or advocating, or even if the foster parent is not doing that, which the foster parent could, but they don't always, we need to be asking the juvenile court to appoint a surrogate parent and have that person be designated the person to be able to advocate for the child. So the reason I talk about this, parental consent, you can't get evaluated, you can't get services. There's a lot of things you can't do without parental consent. So you can go back and look at some of this. I am kind of rushing through it to get to some later points. So what do we first do? We have to request an evaluation. Someone, a parent, needs to request an evaluation. It can come from the parent or the school. So that's another reason we need someone acting as a parent. Now, for kids in the dependency, kids low income, the independent educational evaluation is a vital tool because it can be done at public expense, meaning that the school district, unless their evaluation was perfectly appropriate, they can be required to pay for another evaluation. So if the evaluations aren't comprehensive, it doesn't say what the child needs in order for the special education, it doesn't cover all the disabilities, whatever reason, this is a really vital tool to use. Because, other people can afford private evaluations and then bring them to the school district. Well, our kids don't have that luxury. And it's important to know that these evaluations aren't just academic. They can be a behavioral or a mental health evaluation too. Reevaluations occur every 3 years. They can be waived, but they probably shouldn't. But again, this is where a parent is necessary. So let's talk about, once you're evaluated, you're in, the Individualized Education Program, the IEP, is the cornerstone of this act because it's a written document that puts down what the child needs and the services that are going to be provided. And it's written at a meeting, and this is the team of people that come to the meeting. So the guardian ad litem can, while they're not a parent, they are certainly a person with special expertise that can go to IEP meetings and advocate for the child. So you certainly have access to, legitimate access to go to the IEP teams. Transition IEPs are just, so you know, for either if you're transitioning out of high school or you're transitioning from pre-K into kindergarten, that they have some special requirements. Okay, so again, I've talked about the importance of parent participation, and notice is very important to provide notice to parents. And so, again, if there's a surrogate parent or a foster parent, they all get it must be noticed. They are parents, so it's not just sending it to the biological parent. And in the case of kids with trauma, in the case of kids that have any kind of behavior that impedes the child's learning, the IDEA says that there has to be the consideration of positive behavioral interventions and supports to address that behavior. So this is one of the places where the strategies that we'll talk about in order to get some services for these kids. Least restrictive environments, just a concept you should know, that each public agency must ensure that to the maximum extent appropriate, students with disabilities are educated with students who are not disabled, and that there has to be a continuum of placements from regular school, regular class, all the way to residential. So that's maybe an important part of what a kid with trauma needs. But this is important. So these are the requirement that you don't remove a kid from regular class unless the disabilities occurs only if the nature or severity of the disability is such that education in the regular class with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. So supplementary aids and services are different from related services. They're two separate concepts. Supplementary aids and services are anything to help a child stay in a regular class. So if the child is acting out and needs you can say that in order to stay in the regular class, they need a behavior therapist, or they need a one-on-one, or whatever it is. I mean, we can be creative and talk to the experts. What does the child need? But that's the supplementary services. Related services are things that will enable the child to learn. So, and benefit from the special education. So between the two, there is a wide variety of strategies we can use in order to get services for kids. I throw this in quickly. This was 1982, the first U.S. Supreme Court case that's been the landmark, talking about education under the IDEA. And it had a standard, which anyone who's been to an IEP meeting or tried to advocate for kids has heard from school districts. You know, we only need the Chevy. We only have to provide you the Chevy, not the Cadillac. Just basic services, you know, just as long as it's more than de minimis. We don't have to maximize and that kind of thing. For years, that's been, from this case, what the obstacles that we've come across, that, yeah, they only have to provide this. They don't have to provide everything the child needs. Now that clearly we always thought was not correct. So this year, this case, you should read this case. Andrew F., just in March of this year, said that that's not true. Now it is, they've distinguished between the two cases, so they didn't overturn it. But kids like Amy Rowley in that other case, who were advancing from grade to grade, and was progressing and didn't really need a lot of special education. Well, for that, well, it was a different standard. So, but kids that are not in the regular class, so any kid that's taken out of the regular class, any kid that isn't progressing from grade to grade, the other kids, that there is a higher standard. And so the Supreme Court articulated and said, that the standard now is whether the educational program is reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate to the child's circumstances. May not sound too different, but that really is different from, let's go back to Rowley, where it says, let me see if I put it in the bottom one, reasonably calculated to enable a child to receive some educational benefit. So some educational benefit versus this appropriate in light of the child's circumstances is very important. Yes?
Are you saying anywhere that they're providing residential educational placement?
Yes, so residential placements is part of the continuum, and it's pretty difficult to get a school board to think so, but there is in Florida a way where, you know, I think it's under DCF, I'm not sure, or it might be under the Agency for Persons with Disabilities, but that they pay through Medicaid or through other state funding for the room and the board and everything but the education, and then the school will only have to pay the education. So that rule enables, and they don't tell you about this rule much, but that rule enables you to try to convince the district there's really not, it's not that expensive and this child really needs it, you can't provide it. But they're going to, it's still pretty hard to convince them. But yes, if they cannot provide the education and a residential program can provide an appropriate education, I mean, the law is on your side. It's just hard to convince them.
We're seeing some cases where parents abandon their child because they're so difficult. When you mention DCFS, does that mean that they have to be in foster care, or is there a way to avoid foster care to then place the child in residential?
Well, okay, so the residential, there's different residential placements. One is for educational purposes, another is a residential treatment center, which may be what you're talking about. So I don't know how to avoid the foster care. I'm not really proficient at that. Someone else might be able to talk more about the dependency system part of it. But education-wise, under the IDEA, you can get the residential, whether it's residential treatment, residential care, if the child needs it educationally, which is a little different. We'll just take another question. And
what's the scope of children not advancing grade to grade? Does that mean that they're not progressing from first grade to second grade to third grade, or is it they were left back once, or does it mean that they're progressing in grade, but academically, like their scores are?
Right. It should mean that they are someone advancing in the general curriculum. So it's not even so much the grade as whether they're advancing like every other child without a disability from second to third grade on par, on grade level with them. So, the social promotion shouldn't count. It shouldn't, or someone with an IEP that is, only on a modified curriculum, advancing because they're on an IEP, that shouldn't count as advancing grade to grade. And they did talk in the Supreme Court talked about, you also have to look underneath at the grades, and just because a teacher can give an A, is it really an A? So it has to be, the legal theory is that it has to be a real A or a real B in advancing in the general curriculum. So I'm sorry, one more and then we'll move on.
Back to the last question, the example you were giving, is it like, I represent a child who has cerebral palsy and is in a nursing home.
Oh,
She
yeah.
only gets to go to school when she's feeling well.
Yeah,
So
that's,
is that
okay, well, those cases make me mad, but we should talk more about the kids in the nursing home. Those kids should be getting a lot more services in order to enable them to go to school. I mean, there are some kids that can't be present in a regular school for their safety or whatever reason, but a lot of kids, the school districts just aren't providing enough related services in order to let them get to school. So I'll be happy to talk to you about that later, more specifically. Okay, so Section 504 is a Civil Rights Act for all persons with disabilities, not just kids. And it's about discrimination. It's about people with disabilities can't be denied benefits in any way or be discriminated against. 504 is only for facilities that receive federal financial assistance, which all public schools do, so it applies. It may not apply to all private schools, or in Florida, it would also apply to charter schools. So the action that's prohibited is the denial of the opportunity to participate or benefit from aid, benefit, or the service. Eligibility, there isn't a specific list of disabilities, so it's broader than the IDEA. And this is why kids that have ADHD, attention deficit disorder, that is a disability under the psychiatric diagnosis, DSM, whatever number they're on now, but it's not specifically listed under the IDEA. So if you have ADHD, you are eligible under 504. You are not eligible under IDEA unless you fit under one of those others, which a lot of kids do. They fit under the behavioral or other health impaired. Right, exactly. So that's just one example. So, and there's many mental health diagnoses also that are similar to that, where they're not a disability under the IDEA, but they could be under 504. Oh, and so learning, you have to be, let me go back, sorry, skipped over. So the definition is that disability is an impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. Learning is a major life activity. So There's no age limit. I want to get to the advocacy tips. Okay, so discipline is very important, and you can go through this at some other time, really, but the reason I put it in here is not that you can learn all about discipline under the IDEA today. It's really just so you know, this is where we first see a lot of kids that have experienced trauma, they start getting in trouble in school. So we can use some of the IDEA to advocate for kids with disabilities that are experiencing trauma and go through those processes. This is the standard for the manifestation. Was the misconduct caused or directly and substantially related to the disability? And so if it is a manifestation, they can't discipline you in the same way they discipline regular kids without disabilities, and they have to perform a functional behavioral assessment. And if it is not, then they can discipline you in some ways, but they still have to provide, which is different from the kids that don't have the IDEA protections, they still have to provide free appropriate public education. So the IDEA gives protections for kids with disabilities in discipline. Functional behavioral assessment and behavioral intervention plans are important in order to figure out what's going on with a child and to come up with positive behavioral strategies. Okay, so the other thing to know is that if you're in the discipline process, you can ask for an expedited evaluation, so to get things going quickly.
In the normal process, though, when you ask for an evaluation, is there a time frame that they have to do it under?
Yeah, so this is again where it's important to have a parent because it's from the parental consent. You have 60, and in Florida they do 60 school days. Other states it's just 60 days, which is a big difference. But yes, so.
60 school days.
Right. And then compensatory education. This is if you want to read a good case about kids who are low income and what they need. And this case in the 11th Circuit was a great case and talked about how reimbursement is good for parents that have money to get evaluations, send them to private schools and ask for reimbursement. Compensatory education is an after the fact that if they have been found to violate the IDEA, they can get services in the future to compensate for the failure in the past. Okay, so now how do we use these laws to advocate? One, as I mentioned before, attend IEP meetings. We have important information to share with the team, and they should be considering the trauma history to appropriately assist with identifying the kids' needs. You can inform the school about the triggers, the cues, the social emotional history, and other information about the challenging behavior or learning difficulties. There is a caution that you don't want to overshare if it's not necessary, the confidential information, but you are permitted to share information with the IEP team because that's a confidential process also, but be aware of this too. Okay, so using the IEP, you can advocate for goals and objectives to address the recovery from trauma exposure. We can have activities that are prescribed by a child's therapist to reduce tension and activity. We can put in the IEP methods to help the child stay focused. And if he becomes unfocused or engages in inappropriate behaviors, there could be visual cues that are actually in the IEP. There can be timeouts. There can be, this person is the person that the child has a rapport with. Well, they can go to that person at any time. There's all kinds of ways to structure some of this, but the IEP is where we can specifically ask and get everybody on board to do this for the child. It can include supports to assist with the relationship, self-regulation, academic success, physical health, and safety. Requesting related services, as I talked about. Clearly, mental health and psychological counseling are important related services. Now, the school may limit that to psychological counseling about education or about how to survive in the classroom and that kind of thing. It may not be it may not be the entire psychological counseling a child needs, but it's an important part of helping the child figure out how to cope in school. Parent training is very important. It's a specific related service under the IDEA that we can ask the school district or for the school district to hire someone to train the parent in either the disability, in trauma, in school, in behavior plan. I mean, there's a variety of things the parent may need training in, and this is one tool to get that. Social workers, nurses, if it's needed. Those are all related services that are important. But, again, be creative, and whatever the child needs, we can ask for. It's not limited by these particular things. We can advocate for accommodation. So opportunities for the child to leave the room, go to a special place, those are all kinds of accommodations that we can do. And while I said this is in the IEP, I skipped over a little bit the 504 plan. So if a child has a disability not under the IDEA, but has a disability, you can get what's called a Section 504 plan and list out some of these accommodations too. So these can all be in a 504 plan as well as in the IDEA. And then the supplementary aids and services, these are the ones to enable the child to stay in the least restrictive environment. These are just another examples to let you think about possible ways of helping. So preferential seating, different physical arrangements to reduce distractions, quiet corners, carols, alternative assignments, trauma training to the staff, and then a lot of social behavioral supports are all part of what we can do to ask the school district to provide. Yep.
How do we get trauma training to the schools? How do we,
Now, how this all happens, that's a different question, yeah.
the child has an IEP, the child has a 504, they recommend therapy, they brought in a therapist, they brought all these things, and nobody has any idea how to
Right.
deal with trauma.
Well, what I'm saying is that in the IEP team meeting, that should be discussed and agreed to among the IEP team, that this is important, and then the school district will be obligated to retain somebody and provide the training.
That becomes their obligation. when
Yes.
trauma was identified.
Yes. I mean, it's not as easy as I'm saying, but this is the legal theory here, yeah.
But legally, aren't you going to have an attorney then? Because they are not going to, I've been in a lot of schools in Orange County.
Yeah,
and
well,
I-
Orange County's its own special
and-
place.
But every county is their own special place.
Yeah.
And they don't have even the teachers
I agree.
who know trauma. I mean, we all don't know trauma.
I agree.
So I think this should
Right.
be mandated for every.
Well, I certainly agree with that, but yes, maybe the next step is getting an attorney and challenging and due process and so forth, but it's really important to begin to really do this in the IEP process first, and then if they don't do it or they refuse to do it, there are certainly legal challenges, but if we don't even do it at the IEP level, then doing it later isn't going to help. Okay, so, yes?
I really like your slideshow. Is it possible to download the slides?
Well, it is in the app, but I'm happy to, you can come up and get my card. I'm happy to email it to you if you want, so sure.
I can find it.
Yeah, that's fine. The apps might be a little more difficult, but I'm happy to send it to anybody who wants to come up and give me their email address. Okay, so obtaining appropriate evaluations is another thing we talked about, the independent evaluation, but there are trauma-sensitive evaluations we should be asking for, and there's information out there on the Google. I have a friend who calls it the Google. So we should be doing that, and we should ensure that the functional behavioral assessments, which the school is required to do, includes the trauma-related behaviors. So again, this is going to take advocacy, because you're right, the school districts don't know about this, and it's just going to take us really talking about it and make sure that we advocate for that. And how you do that, there's a meeting where the evaluation and the scope of the evaluation is discussed in a team meeting. So that's where you would, and they just say, oh, well, we're just going to do the Woodcock-Johnson. No, you need to do A, B, and C. That's where you would do that. Okay, so this is the summary. If a child has not been determined eligible for special ed, advocate for the eligibility if that's appropriate for that child under either IDEA or Section 504. And if the child's already eligible, then we advocate for the trauma-informed services. Determine if the child needs a surrogate parent. Ask for an independent educational evaluation. Include trauma-related needs and services in the IEP. Insist on functional behavioral assessments and behavioral implementation, I can't even say this, VIP. Request expedited evaluation if you're in the discipline process, and request compensatory education. So we have a few minutes more. We're going to go over a sample of a child. So Philip, this is a plaintiff in the Compton education, the case out in Compton, California. I don't know if anyone has heard about it. So this is a community that has a lot of violence, and the school district was not providing anything in the trauma-related services to kids. So there's a lawsuit. It's a very innovative lawsuit based on 504 and the ADA, I think, trying to get these services from the whole community, from all of the school district, for all the kids. So this is just one of the plaintiffs. Now think about when we were talking about the ACEs, not just the old one that we went through with you, but think about the community violence, and there's natural disasters, there's all kinds of traumatic events. So he's 15, at an alternative high school, repeatedly experienced traumatic violence and loss. A bullet went through his car when he was sitting in the back seat. He thought he would be killed. He witnessed someone getting shot and killed. He, after witnessing that, he cried, he threw up. He estimates he's seen more than 20 shootings, and he's had guns fired at him, been caught in a crossfire. This is Compton. This is, may not be, your neighborhood, but it is something to think about, whether it's to this extent or not, what the community that kids live in and how that impacts them. So you can read more further, and then he also had a close family member to lost a family to cancer. So what do we think? Does he have any adverse childhood experiences? No, not one. So certainly the violence. What else would be an adverse childhood experience? Having someone die in his family, that's traumatic. And not just being shot at, but then witnessing. It's really a separate thing, watching others get shot at. And if you're constantly in that frame of mind and going through life being scared and having that the bear is going to come get you. So I don't know that we have an exact number. We don't know his family history at all. But he certainly has 2 or 3 that we can count just on this little paragraph that's from the case. So then, as a result, he has difficulty focusing. And this, again, is from the case. Concentrating, can't recall information. He's not happy. He frequently jokes around to distract himself. He doesn't think he's going to live past 25. He's been expelled, and he gets into physical altercations. So just throw out some ideas. What do we think that we might advocate for him in an IEP meeting, assuming he has a disability? What do we think he might need? What was that? Behavioral therapist, I would say, yes. Help him deal with his physical altercations in his anger. A mentor? That's a very good idea. Very good idea. Psychological assistance.
Additional time to take tests because of
That's true. Additional time to take tests because he has difficulty concentrating. What were you going to say? What kind of counseling? Oh, grief counseling. That's a good point. Yes. Anything else? So this is just an idea. So grief counseling, mentoring, those are things you didn't see listed in the IDEA as related or supplementary services, but those are great ideas because that you're learning about this kid and learning about what he needs, and that's what the IDEA is all about. It's about the kid's unique circumstances and unique disabilities, and that's where this Andrew F. comes into play now. It says that, and we can use that, and we should be using that. Whatever that child needs is what we need to be advocating for.
Need a grief counselor in the school.
Yes, you can get a grief counselor in the school. That's my opinion. I don't know what the school says, but yes. If the child needs it, there is, the IDEA gives you a basis to argue and advocate for it. Let's put it that way. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much. Oh, one more.
It's my understanding that you cannot be the parent or the surrogate parent if you are a therapeutic foster home. Because
That's
would be a
true.
conflict of interest.
That's
So
true.
any of our kids who are in a therapeutic home,
Any kind, yes, if it's a therapeutic home or some kind of larger institutional, DJJ facilities, those kind of facilities don't have a foster parent that is a parent under the IDEA. That's
and
correct.
you don't have to have the child TPR to become the educational surrogate.
No, you do not have to have a termination of parental rights to have a surrogate parent. It's just if the parent or the foster parent is not acting as an educational advocate, that's reason enough.
And just to clarify on one of your slides, you said it's not the GAL, and no, it isn't. However, a GAL can be trained and certified and appointed as a surrogate parent.
Yeah, that,
You can also, it could be a guardian ad litem volunteer and a surrogate.
that's true.
So you can be both, right. So
You-
you can do those.
Right, so a GAL can be appointed as a surrogate parent, but just by the fact of being a GAL, you are not a parent. Do you have anything else?
Well, I just wanted to say one more quick thing. Most of the, well, not most of the time, all the time, when you're in an IEP meeting advocating for the one child that you're representing, you're advocating for things that are going to help that one individual child. But there's actually things that you can do where you'll end up impacting all of the children in the classroom, just like a couple cute little things. Like I've seen schools where because one child had a disability and needed some social emotional regulation assistance, the teacher actually put a chart on the wall that was like green to yellow to red, and each kid's name had like a little magnet, and they could, when they came in the morning, let's say that kid didn't have breakfast that morning or watched daddy hitting mommy that morning, and they're not going to go up and tell the teacher, hey, these are the things I experienced, before 9 a.m., but they can just go slide it to bad, I'm not feeling good today, and the teacher knows, okay, this kid might need a little extra attention. Maybe that's why they're not responding. Maybe that's why they're pushing friends. And this is more for younger kids, but by putting that chart on the wall and putting each kid's name on it, now you're helping the teacher see, oh, it's not just this one kid who has an IEP. I have 8 kids in my class who on a daily basis are on red, and it might change throughout the day. They might have a trigger that they're not willing to maybe tell the teacher, this reminds me of something bad that happened, but they notice, oh, Johnny's on red now, what's going on? And so there's things like that that you can advocate for that'll actually end up helping a whole class worth of kids, so.
All right, and you wanted to tell them about the evaluations or something?
Yes, please remember to go to your app and fill out the survey. Self-operated.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I will hand out cards to anyone who needs it. Thank you. Yes.